The Visigothic history of Spain, as it pertains to the Jews, is often told within the confines of a lachrymose conception, to use a term coined by historian Salo Barone. This term refers to how Jewish history is typically seen through a prism of victimhood. In fact, as I've delved deeper into the Jewish question, what has truly amazed me is the visceral reaction Jews have to even the most measured criticisms, or any implication that their historical behavior has somehow possibly contributed to the tragedies they've suffered. The problem seems to be that victimhood carries with it a certain social tender, and once an individual or group acknowledges any responsibility for their situation, that currency is devalued. A German Israeli historian once said, quote, "It is the privilege of the oppressed people to arouse the conscience of the victors," unquote. This is often true even when not discussing Jews, particularly whenever Europeans have oppressed a non-European group. For example, the Indians under British rule, the Mayans under the Spanish, and the Maghreb under the French. Yet, curiously, this is never reciprocated when the roles are reversed. While the native French have been repeatedly berated for their colonization of North Africa, no one recalls that France invaded Algeria in 1830, mostly to put an end to the Barbary slave trade, which had taken over 1 million Europeans into bondage between the 1500s and the early 1800s. The same trade had been affecting the newly independent American colonies as well. In 1786, Thomas Jefferson was visiting London, where he met with and kindly asked an ambassador from Tripoli to discuss what terms the Barbary states might demand in order that they might cease and desist with capturing and enslaving American sailors. In a letter Jefferson wrote to John Adams, he recounts the details of the conversation. Quote, "Soon after the arrival of Mr. J in London, we had a conference with the ambassador of Tripoli at his house. We took the liberty to make some inquiries concerning the grounds of their pretensions to make war upon nations who had done them no injury, and observed that we considered all mankind as our friends who had done us no wrong, nor had given us any provocation. The ambassador answered us that it was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Quran, that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Mussulman who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise," unquote. With this historiographic tendency in mind to disregard the behavior of victims, a fairly common view of the Visigoths is that they relentlessly persecuted the local Jews, due to a combination of religious fanaticism and jealousy of Jewish wealth. I will make no attempt here to dispel the notion that the Jews were persecuted. However, the Visigoths were not some irrational two-bit villain. The late Samuel Parsons Scott, who translated the Visigothic Code into English in 1910, called them cruel in their treatment of the Jews. Yet he also said that they, quote, "manifested a sense of humanity and a genuine philosophy, rarely to be found even among nations that are thoroughly civilized," unquote. In his 44-page preface, he tells us that under the Visigoths, quote, "the punishment for crime was graded according to the wealth of the offender, rather than according to the rank and station of the party injured," unquote. Again, Scott often spoke in a highly critical manner of the Visigothic treatment of the Jews, but in Book 5, Title 5, under Section 9 of his translation of a law regulating interest rates for money lending, he notes that, quote, "the law against usury was habitually violated by the Jews, who extorted enormous rates of interest both from individuals and from the crown," unquote. Quoting a passage from Deuteronomy seems quite appropriate here, even if, inevitably, it will be considered anti-Semitic to do so. Quote, "For the Lord your God will bless you, as he has promised, and you will lend to many nations, but will borrow from none. You will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you," unquote. A person not imprisoned by a Jewish lachrymose conception might deduce hereby that if the Visigoths graded punishments for crime according to the wealth of the offender rather than according to the rank and station of the party injured, and that if the local Jews were exceedingly wealthy and had been violating the local laws more than most, then from these facts alone we would expect to see the Jews disproportionately targeted. Typically, the Jews of 7th century Spain are regarded as a powerless and benevolent minority, when, in all likelihood, they had immense political and economic influence, as well as a deep-seated hatred and animosity toward Christians. While the Catholic Church was indeed intolerant of heresy and paganism, the Jews of the period had just finished compiling the Babylonian Talmud around 500 AD, and were engaging in their own religious fanaticism. This is rarely, if ever, factored into the Visigothic equation. It is my belief that the anti-Jewish legislation of the Visigoths arose in part from a desire to religiously unify the kingdom, but more so as a reaction to hostile Jewish behavior. Standard operating procedure for the Catholics and the earlier pagan Romans had mostly been to grant Jews complete autonomy. Yet, the Jews in Spain supported rebellious factions within the Visigothic nobility. They allied themselves with enemies of the crown, and, contrary to both secular and religious law, they continually enslaved Christians and circumcised them against their will. The anti-Jewish legislation of the period started out very mild, but steadily increased in severity and complexity over time, as initial attempts at curtailing Jewish legal infractions were largely ineffective. The primary sources from the period are regrettably scant. They often contradict each other, and admittedly, I am not a trained historian, nor do I have access to all of the primary sources, in particular the letters of correspondence. But even if I did, I believe it is still worthwhile to cite the opinions of reputable scholars so as to bolster my own conclusions, or at the very least, display that I haven't arrived at them via pure fantasy. The main historians whose works I will rely on and address include, but are not limited to, Edward Thompson, Bernard Bachrach, Roger Collins, and Solomon Katz. My detractors will invariably accuse me of having cherry-picked the content and character of what these men wrote, so it should be stressed here that none of these historians take the same exact stance that I do. In fact, I would characterize most of them as largely philo-Semitic, perhaps even a bit apologetic. Roger Collins wrote that, quote, "The treatment of the Jews by both the secular power and by the Church in the Visigothic kingdom is the most reprehensible feature of its history. From the reign of Recared onwards, a series of laws and conciliar decrees were enacted inhibiting the rights and liberties of Jews, even on occasion requiring them to abandon their own religion and convert to Christianity. Although this legislation was originally only directed against Jewish practitioners of Judaism, those who willingly or otherwise converted to Christianity soon came under the suspicion of the lawmakers and came to be supervised and restricted almost as fiercely as their former co-religionists. What began as a process of lawmaking aimed at the practitioners of a religion ended up as one directed against a race." Unquote. This sentiment is shared, to one degree or another, by many of the historians I've mentioned. Bachrach is a notable exception. While by no means hostile to Jews, he makes a very noble effort to view the period outside the purview of a lachrymose conception. However, the overall trend among most historians on the matter is to mention briefly what the Jews had been doing to the Christians, and then proceed onward as if it were of little consequence. Herein lies one of my principal aims, which is not to justify each and every measure taken against the Jews, but rather to challenge the idea that the Jews were an innocent and powerless bystander, exercising a general attitude of mutual tolerance and respect. The first modern humans entered what is now Spain and Portugal about 40,000 years ago. Genetically, these were Western hunter-gatherers. They all had blue eyes and probably a swarthy complexion, but they did not resemble sub-Saharan Africans, as some people love to claim. Sometime around the 6th millennium BC, Neolithic farmers from Anatolia began entering Spain. Then, around 4000 BC, Indo-Europeans from the Pontic steppe began moving into the whole of Europe. Modern studies have revealed that by 2000 BC, 40% of Iberia's total genetic composition and nearly 100% of its Y chromosomes were replaced by people with steppe ancestry. When the Greeks showed up in the 1st millennium BC, they coined the term Iberian, which is what they called the locals. The nomenclature comes from the river Ebro, which in turn may have simply been a local pre-Indo-European word for river. Whatever the case, it was the Romans who left the most profound linguistic and cultural impact during the 600 years they ruled the peninsula. With the exception of Basque, it is from Latin that all the local languages are derived. The Visigoths were a subset of a larger ethnic group called the Goths, a Germanic tribe who, like the Greeks and Romans, also had Indo-European origins from the Pontic steppe. The 6th century historian Jordanus, himself of Gothic extraction, claimed that his people originally came from what is now Sweden. This has become a matter of debate, but what's indisputable is that by the 3rd century they had migrated from what is now Poland to an area around the Black Sea, where they had become divided into two major factions, the Terwingi and the Greutungi, or as they later became known, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. In the 4th century, Ermanaric, king of the Greutungi, is said to have held dominance over both groups in a vast territory stretching from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea. At the time, the Goths were probably very similar to other Germanic tribes, originally adhering to a form of paganism and ancestor worship. However, during Ermanaric's reign, Ulfilas, a Greek missionary who had been enslaved by the Goths and raised among them, began converting his former captors to Arian Christianity, which differed from Catholicism insofar that it denied the Holy Trinity and considered Jesus Christ to be separate and distinct from God. The pagan aristocracy did not take kindly to these efforts, and under Athanaric, many Gothic converts were persecuted. Christian foreigners, however, were left alone, as the Gothic motives were to protect Gothic culture and heritage, and not necessarily to eradicate Christianity itself. Around 370 AD, the Huns began invading Eastern Europe, and various Gothic groups reacted differently. Some of them tried to resist. Others, such as the Ostrogoths, became vassals to the Huns. The Visigoths, however, sought refuge within Roman territory. A chieftain named Fritigern appealed to Emperor Valens to allow his people to settle on land south of the Danube. The Romans and the Visigoths had been warring with each other, but Valens allowed it, probably because he hoped to recruit Visigoths for the Roman army. Shortly afterwards, however, the Visigoths suffered famine. The region where they settled had not been producing much food, and the Romans were experiencing logistical issues caused by their war with Persia. Under these conditions, the Goths were horribly mistreated by the locals. Gothic parents were forced to sell their children to Roman slave traders in return for dog meat. Eventually, they began rebelling in what is known today as the Gothic Wars, which resulted in the death of Emperor Valens at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. Under Emperor Theodosius, the Visigoths were incorporated into the Roman Empire as foederati. Relations remained turbulent, however, and eventually culminated in a Visigothic invasion of Italy proper and the sack of Rome in 410. By the standards of the age, however, it was fairly restrained. There was no general slaughter of the inhabitants, and the two main basilicas of Peter and Paul were nominated places of sanctuary. Most of the buildings and monuments survived intact, albeit stripped of valuables. A short time later, the Romans permitted the Visigoths to settle on land in southern France and northern Spain, after they had successfully repelled other barbarian tribes from invading Roman territory. By 476, however, the Ostrogoths, who had remained in Eastern Europe as vassals of the Huns, invaded northern Italy and established their own kingdom there. This marked the end of the Western Roman Empire and the beginning of the autonomous Visigothic kingdom in Iberia. Some sources have claimed that the Visigoths in Spain numbered in the hundreds of thousands, but this is likely impossible for a number of logistical reasons, and the archaeological evidence doesn't support it. Roger Collins makes a good case that they numbered somewhere between 20 and 30,000, or the size of a small Roman army. The Hispano-Romans, he says, certainly exceeded 1 million. Whatever the actual figures were, most historians agree that the Visigoths were vastly outnumbered by their Hispano-Roman counterparts, who generally appear to have accepted their rule. Regarding the earliest Jewish presence in Spain, another group of Semites known as the Phoenicians were active traders throughout much of the Mediterranean, alongside the ancient Greeks and Romans. During the first millennium BC, they established settlements at what is now Cadiz. The Roman name for Spain, Hispania, may in fact be a Latinized Phoenician word, Isiphanim, meaning island of the Hyrax. As an aside, the city of Jerusalem also derives its name from another Phoenician word, Shalem, the Canaanite god of dusk. In fact, the Phoenician and Hebrew languages were largely identical, and while the Phoenicians were not Jews per se, it's likely that the Jews formed out of the same ancestral group. As ancient historian and biblical scholar Mark Smith writes, quote, "Despite the long regnant model that the Canaanites and Israelites were people of fundamentally different culture, archaeological data now cast doubt on this view. The material culture of the region exhibits numerous common points between the Israelites and Canaanites in the Iron I period. The record would suggest that the Israelite culture largely overlapped with and derived from Canaanite culture." Unquote. During the late Bronze and early Iron Ages, most Semitic nations worshipped a divine couple, made up of a national god and a female consort. In the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, this divine couple was formed by the god Yahweh and the goddess Asherah. These Jews, if that is what they should be called, acknowledged the existence of other gods. James Miller writes in his book, A History of Ancient Israel and Judah, that while Yahweh emerged as the national God of Israel and Judah, quote, he probably was never worshipped exclusively by the early Israelites, and certainly not during the early tribal period. It must be presumed that Yahweh would have been perceived and worshipped in much the same fashion as the other gods of the Syro-Palestinian pantheon, unquote. Mark Smith informs us again that, quote, one can subject ancient Israelite texts to the same sort of analysis of divine tiers, as the Bible manifests the language of the divine assembly. A number of scholars have discussed the language of assembly, especially in the Psalms and other poetic books. Moreover, the presentation of Yahweh as a king enthroned and surrounded by his heavenly hosts can be found in many biblical passages, such as the first book of Kings 22, Isaiah 6, and Daniel 7. At the top of the Judean pantheon stands the divine couple, Yahweh and Asherah. Many scholars believe that the Asherah in the Jerusalem temple was none other than the symbol of the goddess, either a tree or wooden pole, and that the image was hers. This evidence would suggest that Asherah was a goddess venerated in the Jerusalem temple devoted to Yahweh, and was therefore regarded as his consort. To this evidence, scholars would add the 8th century inscriptions from Kuntilet Ajrud and Kirbet el-Kom that mention Yahweh and his Asherah. What is clear from biblical criticisms of the Asherah is a paradigmic shift away from the model of the divine couple in charge of the four-tiered pantheon to a single figure surrounded by minor powers, who are only expressions of that divinity's power, unquote. As to Yahweh's origins, the current consensus is that he was originally a divine warrior from the southern region associated with Seir, Edom, Paran, and Teman. The oldest plausible recorded occurrence of the name Yahweh is on an Egyptian inscription from the time of Amenhotep III, referring to the Shasu nomads from Midian in Edom and northern Arabia. Curiously, the Shasu, like the Israelites, were a nomadic tribe who had a turbulent past with the Egyptians around the same time the Bible claims the Israelites left Egypt. Two Egyptian texts, one dated to the period of Amenhotep III, the other to the age of Ramses II, refer to Yahu and the land of the Shasu nomads, in which Yahu is a toponym. Scholar Michael Astor observed that the, quote, hieroglyphic rendering corresponds very precisely to the Hebrew tetragrammaton of Yahweh, and antedates the hitherto oldest occurrence of that divine name, on the Moabite stone, by over 500 years, unquote. Scholar Van der Toorn concludes, quote, by the 14th century BC, before the cult of Yahweh had reached Israel, groups of Edomites and Midianites worshipped Yahweh as their god, unquote. Whatever the case, Yahweh may have usurped El's position as the primary god of the pantheon and murdered all his children. As Mark Smith informs us, quote, one biblical text that presents Yahweh in an explicit divine council scene does not cast him as its head, who is left decidedly mute or undescribed, probably the reason why it survived the later collapsing of the different tiers. This text is Psalm 82, which begins in verse 1. God, Elohim, stands in the divine assembly of El, Adat El. Among the divinities, Elohim, he pronounces judgment. Here, the figure of God, understood as Yahweh, takes his stand in the assembly. The name El was understood in the tradition, and perhaps at the time of the text's original composition as well, to be none other than Yahweh, and not a separate god called El. In any case, the assembly consists of all the gods of the world, for all these other gods are condemned to die in verse 6. I myself presumed that you are gods, sons of the Most High, Elion. Yet, like humans, you will die, and fall like any prince. A prophetic voice emerges in verse 8, calling for God, now called Elohim, to assume the role of judge of all the earth. Arise, O God, judge the world, for you inherit all the nations. Here, Yahweh, in effect, is asked to assume the job of all gods to rule their nations in addition to Israel. Verse 6 addresses the gods as the sons of Elion, probably a title of El at an early point in biblical tradition. If this supposition is correct, Psalm 82 preserves a tradition that casts the God of Israel in the role not of the presiding god of the pantheon, but as one of his sons. Each of these sons has a different nation as his ancient patrimony, or family inheritance, and therefore serves as its ruler. Yet verse 6 calls on Yahweh to arrogate to himself the traditional inheritance of all the other gods, thereby making Israel and all the world the inheritance of Israel's God, unquote. Well, that's convenient. The word Israel is theophoric, meaning it's the name of a deity and a verb. The particle Isra means to struggle or fight. Older translations took the name to mean one who struggles with El, yet some scholars now believe today that the original meaning was that El struggles or fights. Whatever the case, the nation of Israel certainly struggled with their Canaanite Phoenician neighbors. As Joshua 10:40 tells us, quote, Joshua struck all the land, the hill country and the Negev, and the lowland and the slopes and all their kings. He left no survivor, but he utterly destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded, unquote. While modern scholarship and archaeology have placed doubts on the notion that the Canaanites were completely wiped out by the Israelites, there's little doubt that the Jews took over much of their territory. In fact, one of the oldest artifacts with Phoenician or ancient Hebrew inscriptions is the Moabite stone. Inscribed sometime around 840 BC, it reflects the perspective of a young man named Mesha, who ruled the kingdom of Moab, and describes how the Moabites retaliated against King Omri of Israel for having conquered Moabite territory. What stands out is that just as Yahweh told the Israelites to make war upon the Canaanites, the Moabite god Chemosh told the Moabites to make war upon the Israelites. Quote, And Chemosh said to me, Go take Nebo against Israel. And I went in the night, and I fought against it from the break of day till noon. And I took it, and I killed in all 7,000 men. But I did not kill the women and maidens, for I devoted them to Ashtar Chemosh. And I took from it the vessels of Jehovah, and offered them before Chemosh. Unquote. It's certainly plausible that Yahweh cultists had traveled to Spain alongside the Phoenicians early on in the first millennium BC. But the question naturally arises as to whether or not these were Jews in any modern sense. To avoid a prolonged discussion on the matter, suffice it to say that the first significant Jewish settlement probably appeared much later. Solomon Katz makes a convincing case that Jews may have had a presence in Spain as early as the 1st century AD, but that no real notable populations are recorded until the 4th century. It should be stressed here that the Jewish diaspora had existed long before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, as evidenced by, among other things, 3 previous Jewish expulsions from Rome between 139 BC and 61 AD. Historian Eric Gruen wrote in his work, Diaspora, Jews Amidst Greeks and Romans, that, quote, compulsory dislocation cannot have accounted for more than a fraction of the diaspora. The vast bulk of Jews who dwelled abroad in the Second Temple period did so voluntarily. Diaspora did not await the fall of Jerusalem to Roman power and destructiveness. The scattering of Jews had begun long before, occasionally through forced expulsion, much more frequently through voluntary migration, unquote. In an interview with website JewishLedger.com, Gruen also said that, quote, the Greek cities of the Mediterranean attracted Jews from every walk of life, from writers and intellectuals to mercenary soldiers who settled in places like Alexandria, Antioch, the cities of Anatolia, Macedonia, and Italy. Throughout the Greco-Roman period, Jews in the diaspora vastly outnumbered those in the homeland, unquote. By the early 4th century, the Jews in Spain had become quite successful agriculturalists, but as Solomon Katz points out, their activities hindered largely on Christian slave labor. He even considers the possibility that, quote, the cultivation of land by the Jews of Visigothic Spain must have been made impossible by the decrees against the possession of Christian slaves, or even coloni, by the Jews, unquote. As to the size of the Jewish population in Spain, the earliest estimates I've seen only go back to about the 15th century after the Reconquista, where something on the order of 300,000 Jews converted to Catholicism, while another 80 to 100,000 were exiled. Whatever the case, it seems very probable that the Jews were vastly outnumbered by their Hispano-Roman counterparts, just as the Visigoths were.